Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to critique and to review some very common arguments that I hear floating around on social media, as well as we'll see on popular television shows, blogs, TikToks. It's kind of all over the place. And these are general assumptions that people tend to make about American slavery. Now, as with most assumptions made about history, these are oftentimes based on an inaccurate understanding of the past. And sometimes, if we're going to attribute malintent, a misrepresentation of the past. And in this case, kind of a whitewashing of the past. This argument can be harmful for many reasons. First and foremost, it's wrong. Secondly, arguments about history are oftentimes used to make some general political point, which is oftentimes what is happening with this argument in particular. This argument hinges around the claim that slavery has existed historically in all ancient civilizations, and that American history, and by extension American slavery, is no different. This argument is interesting. I don't know if interesting is the right word. This argument's problematic, interesting intellectually speaking. This argument's problematic because it's oftentimes unclear what the point of it is. What I mean by that is it's oftentimes unclear why the person is making it. It seems to be politically driven, politically motivated. Explicit political intention is oftentimes not stated. In its most basic form, the argument will make the claim that slavery has existed in one form or another basically since the beginning of human civilization, maybe even prior to human civilization, and that American slavery is just the most recent, not even the most recent, is a iteration of that. Now, again, what the person is trying to prove or to argue from that, like what the general point is usually not stated. But the express purpose of the argument is oftentimes to underplay or to downplay the severity of American slavery. And it does this by misrepresenting what American slavery was. We're going to examine a video clip taken from Bill Maher's show Real Time, in which he is talking about the history of slavery. And he kind of sets up this discussion by talking about ways in which history is used to control the past, or how history is misused to control the past. Oftentimes, again, kind of like how I said at the beginning, the reason why this is done is to present some sort of narrative. The irony here is Bill's utilizing slavery to do the same sort of thing. Again, what exactly he's claiming is a little unclear, very unclear. But what he's critiquing is that education specifically is usually what these discussions revolve around, how the past is taught, that the past is being modified and changed in certain ways to present a particular view of history, to push a certain political agenda. And he's going to take issue with this, especially what he seems to be taking issue with is how people in the past are villainized.
Did Columbus commit atrocities? Of course. But people back then were generally atrocious. Everybody who could afford one had a slave, including people of color. The way people talk about slavery these days, you'd think it was a uniquely American thing that we invented in 1619. But slavery throughout history has been the rule, not the exception. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans, all the way up.
So the first general claim here, oftentimes with these sorts of misrepresentations of the past, will usually start off with the person presenting the argument will start off with a rather uncontroversial claim, and then from that uncontroversial claim move on to a stronger, more controversial claim that they're trying to make. And the uncontroversial claim being made here is a reflection on the history of slavery and the appearance of slavery in most civilizations. Now, I have an entire lecture on the history of American slavery and what exactly makes American slavery distinct from other forms of slavery that you're more than welcome to check out. It's a very long lecture. But on this point, I say it's uncontroversial because no one's really going to sit there and deny that slavery hasn't appeared in all of these different times and places. That's not really the issue with what's being said. As I specify in that lecture, slavery has appeared in various forms across time and place. We see this in every ancient civilization. The reasons for slavery, especially in the ancient world, we have a couple of big factors at play. One is probably the most common form would be debt-based slavery. One person enslaves another person because that person owes them money. And the idea is that they're working off that debt. In civilizations like ancient Greece or ancient Rome, were oftentimes specific rules and regulations, laws that were passed in order to stipulate exactly what debt slavery looked like. You see this, for example, in the Hebrew Bible with rules and regulations about debt slavery and exactly how long you could keep somebody as a debt slave and forgiveness of debts and all that other good stuff. Another very popular form of slavery is slavery via imprisonment, forceful imprisonment, typically at the hands of some sort of conflict or warfare. One group would go to war with another group. The losing group would oftentimes be enslaved. Now, typically, when we're talking about enslavement through warfare, we're almost exclusively talking about men. The fighters who were the ones participating in the conflict or the ones who were enslaved. Sometimes we're talking about women as well. But this is usually, and I talk about this more in the video, this is almost always a temporary state. And the purpose of that slavery is oftentimes to bring that person and their family to incorporate them into what would then be the dominant culture. Slavery appears in many different shapes and forms across civilization. That part is not controversial. What is controversial is Maher's claim that American slavery is just another form of that. That American slavery is similar to and not distinct from the previous examples of slavery that we've seen throughout human civilization. But I'm going to let Maher say a little bit more about that before I dig into it.
The word slave comes from Slav, because so many Slavic people were enslaved, and they're as white as the Hallmark Channel. Who do you think gathered the slaves from the interior of Africa to sell to slave traders? Africans, who also kept their own slaves. We're a species prone to making others of our species our bitch. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Humans are not good people. And the capacity for cruelty is a human thing, not a white thing. That's the truth, even though it doesn't jibe with the current narrative.
So again, I think what Maher's reacting to here is this idea that, and again, this is implicitly kind of stated at several points, is this idea that Americans, especially white Americans, are to blame for African slavery, I think is what he's saying, and that as a result, this blame is misplaced because everybody has slaves. The argument's a little muddled and the exact claims are a little muddled, but that's the general sentiment I'm getting. So let's talk about this comparison between American slavery and previous forms of slavery that existed in the past. This comparison is a false one for several reasons, but the most important reason is that this comparison rests upon a logical fallacy. A fallacy of comparison. In philosophy, we call this a false equivalence. A false equivalence Just a simple, straightforward definition. Drawing an equivalence between two subjects because they share some characteristics while ignoring the significant differences between them. In this case, Maher is drawing a comparison between ancient forms of slavery and modern American slavery simply because they share the same name and the same general category, that category being slavery. So, because both of these instances represent forms of slavery, they are therefore similar or therefore the same. The problem with a false equivalence is that the comparison is fallacious. It's fallacious because in this case, the fact of the matter is a little bit more complicated. They are the same, in this case, in name only. And to draw any sort of further comparisons between the two because they share the same name, that's where the problems start to come in. In common language, this is oftentimes called an apples and oranges comparison. The idea that you're comparing two things that appear to be similar, both apples and oranges are fruit, so they're therefore the same. But this ignores the the qualitative difference in taste, for example, the physical appearance, and then other biological differences between them. The exact same thing is happening here with respect to slavery. Did the ancient Greeks have slavery? Yes. Did the Americans have slavery? Yes. Were those two forms of slavery the same? That is a dramatic oversimplification of the past. American slavery is categorically different from other forms of slavery for two important reasons that we'll talk about. But first and foremost, this is a false equivalence. But let me give you some examples. So one example of a false equivalence, the example that's often used is the apples and oranges comparison, but we can look at a historical example that might shed a little bit more light as to why this sort of reasoning is fallacious. Look for example at the history of urbanization, city living, city life. And you can even pick a city that's been around for thousands of years, such as the city of Rome, for example. Rome existed in the ancient world. Rome, you can still fly there today, exists today. So a false equivalency would be to say that the city of Rome existed in 800 BCE. The city of Rome existed now. It is therefore the same city. Is it the same city? Well, that would ignore the tremendous history that Rome has gone through. The Roman population has fluctuated up to the millions of people and down from millions of people over the course of its history. This also ignores the tremendous amount of technological development that's went into the city. Another example would be to look at something like the history of warfare and say, well, the ancient Greeks carried out warfare. So, for example, if you look at the conquest of Alexander the Great, and then to say that we have examples of warfare in the 20th century, of Greece entering into warfare in the 20th century, and to draw some sort of comparison between the conquest of Alexander the Great and, let's say, World War I, right? You can see how that comparison, while we're talking about the same sort of event, warfare, physical conflict, that's about the extent to which we can draw that comparison, because the time periods, the technology used, the physical amount of people that participated in these are radically different from one another. And that's the same thing that's happening here with Maher's explanation and comparison of ancient slavery to American slavery. The reason why historically this is a false equivalency is because American slavery is categorically different from slavery in the ancient world for two very important reasons. The first reason why American slavery is different is pointed out by the historian Howard French. This is a book that I'm currently reading that I would highly recommend. It's called Born in Blackness. It's a history of the continent of Africa, going back to the ancient world through the medieval period. But French, I think, says it very well. The most important distinction between American slavery, And this isn't just American slavery, to start off with, it's European slavery in general. One of the most distinguishing features of American slavery is that American slavery is a racialized slavery. It's the enslavement of a particular group of people based off of their ethnic background. This is what French says. It was the blackness of Africans that offered the convenient rationale of a categorical difference from whites, something that became a prime justification for a new and soon to be dramatic expansion of slavery. Here, too, in this very same essentialization or categorical thinking, lay the origins of modern racism. From the get go, especially in what would become the United States, the reason why Africans were chosen is because they were a people who were distinctly different. And this is, I would like to read you another quote that kind of highlights this. This is from another historian, David Blight, talking specifically about the development of racialized slavery in the United States. This is what Blight has to say. This disorder that the indentured servant system had created made racial slavery to Southern slaveholders much more attractive. Because what were Black slaves now? They were a permanent, dependent labor force who could be defined as a people set apart. They were racially set apart. They were outsiders. They were strangers. And in many ways throughout the world where slavery has taken root, especially where people are considered outsiders and can be put in a permanent status of slavery. So the key here is that specifically within the context of the United States and the development of the plantation system, there were certain reasons why African slaves were chosen over and against European slaves, the Slavic slave trade that Maher mentions, and over and against Native American slaves that were first enslaved by the Spanish. This reason, first and foremost, includes their ethnicity, includes the fact that they are Africans. Why does that become important? It's important for a lot of different reasons. Very briefly, it's important because one, physically, they stand apart from their European counterparts because of the color of their skin. Two, they were forcefully removed from their homeland, ripped away from their native culture, brought to a new place, and this sets them as a culturally speaking, a people who are set apart, who are distinct, who are different. Not only do they not look the same, but they also don't speak the same language. They don't have the same religious practices. This becomes their sort of new social status, right? A social hierarchy begins to appear with white European Christians at the top and African slaves sort of at the bottom. So they're set apart racially, they're set apart culturally. By culturally, I mean linguistically, physically, how they lived. And the other big reason which separates American slavery from previous forms of slavery is what I would call the institutionalized brutality of it. Not only are these people being enslaved, but in the place that they are taken to, they do not have the same legal status as the other people do. Slavery, when it appeared in the ancient world, in civilizations like Greece and Rome, there were certain legal stipulations to what could or could not happen to a slave. You see this, for example, in Plato's dialogues, especially in Plato's Euthyphro, where Socrates meets Euthyphro. Euthyphro's going to court because he's suing his father over the mistreatment that resulted in death of his father's slave. There's this idea in the Greek world, at least, that slaves, especially, well, male slaves, had certain rights. Those rights will be categorically denied in American slavery. And in the American South and in America specifically, there are specific laws that are passed to ensure that Africans remain in the status of being a slave. This includes things like forbidding slaves how to read or write, forbidding slaves how to use and perform certain tools and to go into certain types of trade. And most importantly, when we're talking about American slavery, we're talking about lifelong slavery. Not only were you captured and became a slave, but you would be a slave for the rest of your life. Not only would you be a slave for the rest of your life, but any sort of family that you've had and any sort of children that you produced would also be slaves. It's a permanent status of slavery that was transferred from one generation to the next. And this had immense historical repercussions for the plight of African Americans in the United States. So it's a false equivalency because we see no equivalent to American slavery at any point throughout history. American slavery is completely different in the same way that the level of conflict and warfare that we see in World War II is completely different from the type of warfare that we saw with the conquest of Alexander the Great. It's that stark of a difference. They are similar, yes, but it's in name only. Chattel slavery is categorically different than debt slavery or being a slave as a result of a prisoner of war. Okay, well, I hope that you like this video. Like I said, this is a very popular argument that I've seen floating around. Bill Maher is not the only person making it. I'm probably going to do some more of these kind of review videos. And yeah, let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'll see you all later.